This episode of Keys to the Shop is brought to you by Prima Coffee. Whether it's espresso machines, manual brewing devices, or general coffee shop needs, they seek to pursue the most innovative coffee products, both domestic and abroad, to offer their customers. Find out more at prima-coffee.com. This is Keys to the Shop, episode 63, What Your Roaster Wants You to Know, with Rob Hose of Nossa Familia Coffee. Hello everyone, and welcome to another episode of Keys to the Shop, where we give you insights, inspiration, and the tools you need to grow as a coffee service professional. My name is Chris DeFirio. I'm your host for the show, and I'm really excited to have you along today. Right before we get started, I do want to thank our sponsor here at Keys to the Shop, and that is Prima Coffee. So Prima Coffee is a specialty coffee equipment supplier, and they are based out of Louisville, Kentucky. And from the beginning of their company, they have set out to make the best coffee brewing equipment available to the general public. And their focus in this is on curating the best equipment for every need, from grinders to espresso machines, under-counter refrigeration, pour-over setups, home barista, whatever you do in coffee, Prima has what you need. And you can go and check out their website to see what I mean, prima-coffee.com. There you will not only find a really great selection of products, but you'll also find a lot of resources too, like videos teaching you how to use the equipment, some helpful tips on cleaning and maintenance, things like that. So they put a big emphasis on having the expertise to help their customers get the right gear to fit every situation. And I've known them for a while and use them in the stores here in Louisville. I can't speak highly enough about them. So reach out to Prima Coffee, go to their website, prima-coffee.com, and I know you'll love working with them just like I do. So thank you again to Prima Coffee for their support of Keys to the Shop and also supporting us as an industry by giving us the tools we need to do our jobs well. So Keys to the Shop news here, we were nominated for a Sprudgie. Sprudge.com has their annual Sprudgie Awards, where they nominate the best in several different categories like Notable Roaster, Best New Cafe, Best Coffee Writing, and there's a Best Podcast, Best Coffee Podcast category. And Keys to the Shop is nominated and is a finalist in that. So really excited about that. And if you have not voted yet, and you like what Keys to the Shop does, and it's impacted you in a positive way, I'll be really grateful for your vote. Voting ends on the 31st of December. So you go to sprudge.com/vote and fill in the survey that they have for all the different categories. And a huge, huge thank you to everyone who voted already in that. I really appreciate you all, and it's just an honor. Like I've said before, this is just a great honor to be able to do this show, talk with the people who I talk with, and present these ideas to you to help you thrive as a professional in coffee. So today's guest is going to help us do just that. I'm excited to bring on the show Rob Hose. So Rob Hose is an author, a coffee roasting consultant, and director of coffee for Nossa Familia Coffee out in Portland, Oregon. And he has a diverse range of experience within the specialty coffee industry, and that includes being a barista trainer, roaster, green coffee purchasing and consulting. He holds the highest level of certificates from the Roasters Guild of America, and he serves on its executive council. He works as a subject matter expert, content developer, and instructor for the Specialty Coffee Association, the SCA, and he is a certified trainer for Loring's Smart Roast. Rob travels around the world instructing on coffee roasting methodology and technology. And it was back in 2015, in March, that Rob published a book on the subject of coffee roasting that is called Modulating the Flavor Profile of Coffee, One Roaster's Manifesto, and it's sold nearly 6,000 copies worldwide. Rob manages the entire coffee program at Nossa Familia Coffee, developing relationships with farmers and importers, ensuring quality control, managing roast profiles. So like I said, we're really excited to have Rob on the show. So today we are going to get some insights from Rob on the book and some things about roasting. We're going to learn about roasting coffee. We're going to learn his perspectives on the roasting industry, and we're also going to hear from him about the relationship between the barista and the roaster, and what are some things that Rob believes are important for baristas, front of house staff, if you will, to know about roasting coffee. How should we educate ourselves in a way that will further our career, and how can we communicate with production more effectively? Sometimes that's a little bit hard to do. We live in different worlds, and sometimes we miss each other here and there. So we discussed that and many more things in this episode. Rob has a lot of great things to say, and I know you're going to get a lot out of this episode. So without anything else from me here, let's bring you to my conversation with Rob Hoos. Well, Rob, thank you for being with us today. Welcome to Keys to the Shop, and how are you?
I'm doing great, Chris. How are you doing today?
Oh, doing really well. You've been really busy with your book and with consultation, and I just see lots of your presentations around. I hope you're getting a chance to settle in for the holidays a little bit here.
Yes, absolutely am. December and January, I've got no travels planned, so I can just kind of chill out with the kiddos and with the wife and have a good time.
Yeah, awesome. There's been such a huge demand for your time and for your book, modulating the flavor profile of coffee. I want to get into the book a little bit, but first, kind of an origin story, if you will. How did you become a roaster? How did roasting get to be such a big part in your life, and now you've got a book about it?
Yeah, so I started in coffee. Started my journey with coffee even before I was employed in coffee. It was just something that was, I really appreciated the flavor of coffee and the flavor differences that you could get. One of my really close friends, Zach Lemon, and I, we used to just get together every single night, and we'd each buy a different coffee from a different roaster around the U.S., and we'd French press them side by side and sit and drink coffee and watch stupid movies. And that was pretty much like most of my high school and early college. So when I had the opportunity in college to join up with a coffee shop and start working on the espresso bar, it was kind of like a dream come true or a great fit. And then, most of the way into my master's degree, I kind of had the realization that I didn't actually want to pursue the degree field I was studying in. And I actually really wanted to kind of stick with coffee. So I stopped about basically I had a thesis to turn in. And that was about it, but I didn't really see the need to pay for the thesis and all that sort of stuff if I just planned to work on coffee for the rest of my life. So that's kind of the direction I went. I was working at a cafe in Cincinnati, Ohio, and they had a roaster inside the cafe, and I was given the opportunity to get on the roaster by my boss there, and just absolutely loved it. I like to joke that they let me get on the roaster by myself because they didn't have to employ two people, as I was large enough to carry a whole bag myself, and we stored all the coffee in a back closet. But I hope that he saw my general interest in coffee and my inquisitiveness and my desire to be exacting and precise. And I'm hoping that's more the real reason. But I think the best reason to give is probably just because I could lift a bag and he didn't have to staff two folks.
Well, it worked out perfectly for both of you.
Yeah, it worked out great for me, too.
Yeah. So have you always been that type of person that was just exact and detail focused?
Only in certain things, to be perfectly honest. In coffee, it was just kind of one of those things that I really got into that way. In my personal life, I'm sometimes a little bit scattered and very imprecise at times. So, yeah, it's just kind of a weird fit for me and just something that I've really latched on to.
So, and more so than making coffee. So, I mean, what you do as a barista in some ways, is similar to roasting because you create different beverages. You have to dial things in, creating profiles in a sense. But roasting really attracted you. Was it just the mechanical nature of it, the predictability of it?
Honestly, both kind of go hand in hand to me. One of the things that I think is a disservice to the roasting industry is when roasters don't know how to brew or how to extract coffee properly. And I find that both are incredibly important because a lot of times when I go out to do a consult or work with people, There's been actually multiple occasions in which the reason that they called me out there was because they were unhappy with how the coffee tasted. It was really an extraction problem and not something that they were doing on the roasting side. So I think for me, having a comprehensive understanding of both the barista and brewing side as well as the roasting side is absolutely crucial and both equally fascinating to me.
I mean, so why do you think that is that roasters can tend to not ignore, but be light on the brewing side of things?
It just depends on the background I think that people come from. If you started in coffee as a barista and did a lot of brewing and extraction, and my pathway was basically a barista to a barista trainer to a production roaster to a head roaster to a director of coffee. That was kind of the path that I went in. And I value that because I had the experience of brewing and everything. Now, if you came up from kind of inside the production side, if you came up as, maybe a delivery driver or a bagger, and then you just kind of stuck around and kept with it, and then you ended up on the roaster, you would necessarily have less experience with brewing. And unless that was something that, either your boss or you kind of helped you get training in, it might be a very difficult area in which to catch up because there is kind of a lot of information in the brewing world as well. So I think that's part of it. Is it just depends on which way people come through.
So what is it that you consider your mission as a roaster, or what is the position of a roaster to you? Your book is subtitled a manifesto, One Roaster's Manifesto. So what is it that is your mission and your purpose as a roaster?
So for me in general, my purpose is to try and unlock the best potential qualities that the coffee has inherent in it, while mitigating some qualities that may be considered less pleasant. So for me, it's all about flavor development. But I would say that there's a caveat within that there's different types of roasters in our industry necessarily. There are people who are production roasters who they come in and they are able to very accurately and effectively and quickly repeat batches over and over and over again. And that's the kind of person that handles the bulk of the production for most coffee roasting companies. Sometimes that personality is the same person who is also kind of designing the profiles and being a little bit more of an artist in the sense of they're choosing the expression of that coffee and how that coffee is going to taste. So there's definitely kind of a little bit of both sides to it. So for the production roaster, the goal is consistency primarily, first and foremost. And they are going to be delivering a consistent product, roasting coffee in a similar fashion to the same, chemical change points into the same end color with the same development time, et cetera, et cetera. And then for those who are kind of designing the profiles and doing more profile roasting in the sense of trying to do development or development roasting, that person is going to be looking to kind of unlock the potential for the coffee to the best of that coffee's ability and then present that to the people doing production so that they can consistently repeat this amazing taste from a coffee. Mm. At the end of the day, what I always tell some of my friends is, really we just turn beans brown and they taste good.
Yeah, like pouring milk in a cup, making a picture.
Yep.
Yeah, so you're mitigating the negative, you're highlighting the positive. Of course, there's a huge complex world beneath the tip of that iceberg, and
absolutely,
yeah, and that's something where that's your life, that's your livelihood, and when it comes to writing the book, you at some point through your roasting career have developed a particular way of seeing the roasting craft. And also then seeing a need in the industry based on what you knew and maybe what people didn't know or what you wanted them to know. So why write a book? I mean, what are you fighting for in the book?
Part of it comes from my own experience. So starting roasting in Cincinnati, it was really tricky and difficult to get connected with the greater industry in a lot of ways. I was just out of college and paying for college and all that sort of stuff. You're young, you don't really have a lot of money. And if your business isn't able to send you to any of the events where you can interact with other people in specialty coffee, you find yourself kind of isolated and on an island. In some communities, people are very open to share locally, and in some communities, they're less open to share locally, although I think that that's changing. And so when I first started roasting it, I really felt quite isolated in general. There were people who were opening up and who were eagerly sharing anything that they had information on, but there was also realization on my end that to answer the question of, well, how should I roast a particular coffee to bring out a certain flavor, there just really weren't answers, or at least not answers that were being shared with me. And I thought that the greater roasting community had a handle on it, but I didn't have access to them at the time. So I did get a chance to go to a roasters event and met up with some people who now are no longer in business, but they were willing to sell me a roaster for fairly cheap, a 1 kilo. And so I decided that I really wanted to purchase a roaster and start doing the experiments myself, because if I couldn't get access to the industry's knowledge, then I would kind of come upon that knowledge by myself. And the idea being that roasting isn't necessarily this magical, mystical, artistic thing, but that it must be backed by scientific principles, which through experimentation, observation, and repetition, you should be able to repeat, and you should be able to kind of explore what actually happens to the coffee. And in addition to that, the thought is that, you know, while there are chemical differences in the coffee and differences in terms of how the coffees taste and flavor, the generic makeup of coffee is fairly similar. It's coffee. And so the idea was that these shifts in terms of the flavor should be something that we could see happen across different coffees, different processing methods, different origins, different altitudes, etc. And so really just kind of looking for generic changes in the spectrum of how coffee tastes based on how the coffee is being roasted was kind of my driving goal. And so what I did is, once I got my hands on this roaster, I started roasting one coffee every single way I could think of, documenting where I was making changes and tasting it. And coming up with the control points was a little bit more oriented around like, okay, well, if coffee is something that is the flavor is able to be affected, which I think we would all agree it is, then it must be based on some sort of chemical or physical change that's occurring. And so the chemical and physical changes kind of became my guideposts for how to break down a profile and how to manipulate different parts of the profile as individual segments. So, you know, the first being color change to yellow, where the Maillard reaction is starting. The second being first crack, which is where the physical effects of sugar caramelization and pressure buildup that have happened are evident by the coffee's rapid swelling and expansion. And then, you know, the length of development time, the end temperature, as we know, the amount of caramelization that's allowed to happen based on the temperatures that it's brought to is very important, or the number of chemical reactions, not just caramelization, but so end temperature / end color, both whole bean and ground, and the overall roast length also being important. So, you know, basically I started in my head of, okay, you know, let's approach this in some sort of reasonable fashion, figure out how to break it down, try and manipulate each segment independently and separately, and then see what happens to the flavor using the SCA cupping form. So that was kind of how I got started in that whole thing. And it was really escalated by a couple of times I got to go to roasting events with the SCAA, now the SCA. And during some of these classes that I paid to take, I thought that I would be kind of taught some of these deep secrets of our industry. And I realized that nobody was really holding back any secrets, and that it was really just kind of open for exploration at that point in time. So what I wanted to do was to do a lot of research in terms of reading all the materials, both scientific articles, books, journals, whatever I could get my hands on in terms of coffee chemistry, link those with what I was noticing in the changes in the cup flavor, and then put out a piece that would not only kind of state my observations, which there was a number of times where I almost named this book Observations in Roasting, which equally has a dry ring, so, as does modulating. But, you know, to share my observations with people so they could benefit from the experiments that I had done. And then one of the things that I put very early on is that my hope and my goal was for this to be a framework for the scientific community to start testing and exploring whether or not it was true. So that was one of the other reasons that I wrote it, was to kind of set forth these experiments and say, like, hey, let's see what kind of meat we can put on these bones. And was very lucky recently. I know this is a rambling answer to your question, but very lucky in the last few years that Morten Munchau out of Copenhagen, Denmark, a great personal friend of mine who runs Coffee Mind Academy out of there, who also works as a researcher with the University of Copenhagen in terms of coffee research. He and I have started actually putting these to the test using sensory panels and, scientific method that some of the analysis goes beyond what I was originally able to do, which is absolutely fantastic. So that was kind of my goal, was multi-pronged, to provide access to people who were in areas that were a little bit more isolated from the global specialty community and maybe didn't have access, whether it be financial or geographically caused. And then also to put out kind of my theory on how coffee's flavor changes based on roasting profile differences, and have that actually be tested and see if there's any substance to it.
Well, how has that been received?
So far, great. Morton and I have done a lot of legwork, and we've had some really interesting results. We've had some results that were not exactly what we were hoping for in terms of, really when it comes down to it, we kind of obsess about coffee in our industry. And I think coffee tastes a lot more similar than we want to give it credit for. And, we'll notice these small nuanced things, but maybe a tasting panel, depending on whether it's consumers or specialty people, may or may not notice the differences as strongly as we think that we notice them. But one of the things that I kind of had to start breaking down was the definition of body for coffee is not something that, say, oh, it's body. Oh, it's mouthfeel. What's that mean? What's the weight? Well, what does that mean? Okay, if a TDS is out the exact same, are there any differences in terms of the actual weight or mouthfeel, or are there other things kind of featuring that? And out of this, I found that for my personal understanding of what body is, there's some connections with aftertaste as well as bitterness and how I perceive those that kind of interact with how I perceive body too. So for me, it's been a great personal journey as well. But we presented it a number of times. We presented it most recently together in Poland. We presented it at the Sensory Summit in January. So we've been going around and co-speaking on these flavor changes as well, which has been a lot of fun.
That's awesome. The most feedback a roaster gets, to my mind, is from the retail world, or people who purchase the roasted coffee or brew the roasted coffee and taste a particular thing, or they say it has a XYZ flavor array, or the body is heavy or light. And it sounds like some of what you're talking about is challenging our sensory dogmas from a roaster's perspective on what changes in the bean, what changes during the roasting process, is really not as simple as just saying it has heavy body or light body. So if you're questioning these things in your book, in your work, it sounds like we need to maybe not be as confident, I would say, in telling a roaster, your coffee tastes like this, you should change it.
Yeah, and that's so from the consumer side, it's real tricky because there's so many different styles of brewing. There's so much different brewing equipment out there. Depending on what the particle distribution is on their grinder, or the particle size distribution is, how hot their water is, what they're like. One of the things that I think has been really eye-opening for people in our industry recently has been the ongoing discussion on water. With Chris and Maxwell's book, Water for Coffee, and with all the other research that's been going on how brewing water affects coffee. Mm-hmm. What people don't realize, I think, is that there are two things in your cupping lab as a roaster that influence your actual roasting style. And that is the minerality and the water content, or the water makeup of the water you're using in your lab. And there's your coffee to water ratio that you use when you're cupping or brewing in your lab. And when we're making changes based on what we're tasting on the table or what we're tasting when we brew, we're really making changes to the roast based on a particular coffee to water ratio and a particular water. And that doesn't really apply across the board easily. So, for example, in our roastery here in Portland at No Familiar Coffee, we are intentionally not doing anything to our water except for filtering out chlorine and solids, like big chunks or something like that, because most of our customer base is here in Portland, and our water in Portland is usually between 20 and 50 parts per million in terms of the the mineral content, which is
Right.
very low, and it's below spec for sure.
Yeah.
But we have to have a roasting approach that makes the coffee soluble enough that they can get a proper extraction from their homes, from the cafes, from the bakeries, from everywhere that it's being brewed in Portland, Oregon. And so we're very intentional in the fact that our cupping standards are to the same coffee to water ratio that we use on our batch brewers, and that our water in our lab reflects the water in the greater Portland metro area. Now, if you take our coffee and you brew it on SCA water, it tastes a little bit dark and roasty because the extra mineral content helps extract more solids, and so we actually end up going a bit more toward over extraction when you brew it on different water. So, which has been funny because every time we'd submit to a competition, the feedback would come back as roasty, and we're like, this doesn't really taste roasty to us. And then, when the whole water stuff started coming out, it was a real big light bulb for us. Like, oh, that's why, because we hadn't been roasting with the competition's water in mind. We'd just been submitting production roasts.
So and you're roasting for your clients, your cafes, and is there more harm done than good by having a lot more connectivity with the outside industry, considering the elements and the environments in which coffee is being consumed are so much different, are so different from back home? So, like you say, your coffee isn't necessarily getting a fair extraction if it's being brewed in a totally different environment, like where the water is hard or harder or softer than where you are now. Are we chasing something that's impossible by having our coffee taste great to everybody?
I mean, I think in the coffee industry, we're always chasing the dragon a little bit, because we're treating an agricultural product as if it's consistent enough that the crazy scrutiny we give it on the cupping table is realistic, which maybe it is, maybe it isn't. But I think that there is something to say about just the logistics of it in terms of at least the competition side. Like on the competition side, they couldn't treat everybody's water the same. From us as a roaster retailer side, I'd say that selling coffee abroad is going to be more difficult than selling it locally because you don't exist in the same system. And so it's a bit more difficult for the coffee to taste exactly as you as intended. You can give guidance in terms of brew guides. Like, for example, some people just ordered coffee from us. And so, we saw where they were at. We shot them a little email and said, like, hey, just heads up, you may want to grind just a little bit coarser because you guys have a much higher mineral content in general than we do. Now, obviously, we're not catching all the customers that do that, but if we notice one, we'll try and kind of say something. But it is really difficult, and I think it's a very difficult thing that we're doing. We can't really create a roast that's going to be good on every type of water, that's going to be perfect on every way that people are brewing. It's a really challenging thing. One of my other favorite questions that we'll get at the roastery all the time is, they want me to grind this for XYZ brewing device. What grind setting should I use? And, the real question is, well, how are they brewing on that brewing device? AeroPress is one of the bigger ones, right? If you're doing an inverted AeroPress and you're letting it sit there for 2 or 3 minutes, it's a lot different than if you're doing an AeroPress the standard way and you're brewing it through in like a minute.
Right.
And so even with the AeroPress, you could have multiple different grind settings that could be right depending on how a person is deciding to brew it. So there's a lot of different factors that come into play when we talk about like how our coffee leaves and how we intend for it to be interpreted versus how it's actually interpreted by the customer as they're consuming it.
So by a natural process, like coffee natural selection, somebody looking for a roaster will land on one that just happens to maybe just roast according to water that's most similar to theirs and not even realize it.
It's definitely possible, or roast in such a way that it meets up with how they're brewing the coffee.
Mm-hmm.
So, for example, if somebody here in Portland with a low mineral content was doing an incredibly long extraction already, like let's say they were doing a French press for 8 minutes or something like that, and that was just how they like to brew their coffee, it's possible that they would prefer a coffee from a place that has a higher mineral content because the fact that they are grinding it maybe too fine and extracting it for maybe too long would play out better for a coffee that was roasted to be less water soluble. it's a very interesting kind of line of reasoning or line of thought, I think, to really get into. So yeah, I think people land on the coffees they like for reasons that may exist outside of them just simply liking it. There could be a lot of different factors influencing why they do or don't like a particular coffee.
Right. Well, they say that it's under. A lot of what people say about coffee now is that the coffee is roasted under or over, mostly under these days if we're talking about third wave coffee and all that. But it sounds like maybe what's happening is that there are actually better roasters out there than we think. Like there are more good roasters out there that are doing a great job, and we're just not translating their work fairly.
Yes, and I will say to my shame, that is something early on in my industry I didn't pay as much attention to. But I would go for example, a lot of California, because of the drought, has hard water. And so if you're tasting coffees from California, there's a chance that they're being designed with harder water in mind. And so when I would bring them into Portland, or if I was using distilled water back a long time ago, before I knew too much even about brewing, I might come to the conclusion that they are just underdeveloping their coffee, and that it's on the roasting side, and on and on and on. But then I might go to their shop when I'm visiting and taste it and be like, oh, well, this is absolutely brilliant. And then when I get home, be like, oh, this is way underdeveloped. And maybe it's not underdeveloped. Maybe it's underdeveloped for the water that you're using in the length of time or the grind setting that you're using. You might just be under extracting the coffee, and maybe for them it's perfectly developed. I think there are instances in which people are underdeveloping the coffee, but I would rather give a roaster the benefit of the doubt that I'm just not preparing it right, because there's so many factors that go into whether or not I enjoy a coffee.
Sure. Just like if you're a roaster, there are a lot of factors that happen on the farm that affect what potential you can get out of that coffee, and you kind of need to investigate that.
Absolutely.
And so it kind of brings me to my next question here, which is that a barista who is hearing this and thinking, boy, maybe I've not been giving roasters a fair shake, and wants to investigate the matter further, what should those of us who are in professional coffee service, baristas, managers, etc., what should we know about roasting that will help us improve our craft? Like, what are the best elements that we can start with in the learning process?
Right on. That's a great question. So some of the things I would say is just read anything that you can get your hands on is the first. There are tons of books I could recommend. But I would say just whatever you can get your hands on, read. Always read with a grain of salt, because coffee is such a young industry that a lot of things are still in progress right now, and we're learning as we go. So keep reading, challenge ideas, challenge it, with your own testing. Be as dogmatic as you can in your testing. But some simple kind of fun things. Online, there are different water quality maps you can look up to see, like, if you're buying a coffee from a particular roaster. Let's say you're running a multi-roaster cafe. When you buy a coffee from a particular roaster, you should look at the general water hardness in the area, and that could inform you as to whether or not you should do a finer grind maybe to start with, or a coarser grind to start with, so that you can get dialed in a little bit quicker with that coffee. I would highly recommend the Water for Coffee book. Check that out, read it. The SCA has a number of different workbooks that are great. There's the coffee brewing workbook. There's the cupping book. There's the water quality book from the SCA. It's definitely worth looking at. On the roasting side too, there's a lot of things that kind of come into play on the roasting side that even most roasters don't really realize. So a little bit of knowledge could unfortunately make somebody quite dangerous. Always keep that in mind when you are approaching anything. Because I've had people before who are in the roasting community, I'll tell them, like, oh, well, I roast to 410 degrees Fahrenheit for this coffee. And they'll say, holy crap, that's hot. That's like nearly second crack. Well, it is, depending on your thermocouple thickness. So 410 Fahrenheit on a 6 millimeter thermocouple is going to be close to second crack. 410 Fahrenheit on a 1.5 millimeter thermocouple is still having first crack happen in the cooling tray as it comes out.
Interesting.
Often. So there can be wild swings, and there's a lot of information out there that is just going to be a little bit too general. So whenever you're reading any information about roasting, kind of take it with a grain of salt, and realize that if you know a little bit, it doesn't mean you know actually what's happening.
Right. Well,
within the industry.
That's how the dogmas form.
Yes, yeah, and there's been a lot of times where I've had people come to me and say, "Okay, well, you're roasting this wrong," and they have no background in roasting, and it does feel like a little bit frustrating because on the brewing side, I know the brewing quite well, having been a barista trainer for years, and so normally I'll end up finding that the problem, like a couple times, I found that people had inadvertently set their brewers up to be brewing at about 180 instead of 200 to 202. So the water temp was just too low. But so it wasn't a roasting issue at all, but they were trying to point it out as being a roasting issue, suggesting we were underdeveloping or something like that.
Oh, that's embarrassing.
It's just one of those things where it's like we take for us as a roastery, we take absolutely every complaint incredibly seriously. And so if somebody calls and says, "Hey, something tastes off," the first thing we're doing is we're running through all of our roast log data. We're making sure that we hit all of our time and temperature marks along the way. We're making sure that our QA/QC came out, the weight loss was in spec. All that sort of stuff. And more often than not, we end up tracing the problem back to a malfunctioning brewer, an uncalibrated grinder, something along those lines. So, but yeah, so, double check everything first. Make sure that you're hitting the right brew button. Make sure that you're grinding the coffee appropriately and that somebody hadn't come by and messed up the grinder. But so far as actually, and I say all this kind of jokingly, there are so many fantastic baristas out here that don't need to hear me say that. So
sure,
I have a lot of respect for folks in our industry for that. So I would say, on the roasting literature side, take a look through homebarista.com. They've got a wonderful roasting section on there. There's a ton of roasting blogs and books out there. I would say they're worth checking out. Check out some old school material too. Michael Sivets, Coffee Roasting Technology. Take a look through that. It's got some fantastic stuff. Illy, in the book Espresso, The Science of Quality, has a fantastic chapter or two on roasting. Very much worth a look through. Mr. Scott Rayo's got a book out there that's got some fantastic information in it. If you want to check out my book, it's great. It'll put you right to sleep, so it's better than Ambien in that sense. But I mean, you can. There's a lot of resources out there. Take all of them with a grain of salt. And if anybody claims that something is a certain way, period, and that's just it, it's probably not necessarily the case. And even with consultants too, one of the things that I think consultants have a hard time with, so if you do bring on a consultant for any sort of education as a barista or go to a class where somebody's teaching in a group, we often will have a hard time separating our own perspectives and opinions from objectively what the coffee is like. And so one of the things that I always try and tell people is that I, as a roasting consultant, am not your customer. And my preferences for a particular coffee do not reflect the preferences of your consumer for a particular coffee. So make sure that you're roasting so that your customers are happy, because I might buy one 12-ounce bag a year from you, if that. So you're not going to make any money off me, which means you shouldn't roast coffee the way that I want it. You should roast coffee the way that you want it as a person who enjoys, hopefully, your own coffee and the way your customers want it. So kind of always take that into perspective as well. So I think baristas should learn as much as they can about roasting, because it's a fantastic part of our industry. And it helps them to understand a little bit what they're doing on the brewing side, I think, as well. And likewise, roasters should hit up their baristas and should, I think, befriend their baristas as much as possible to learn as much as they can about what's going on the brewing side, what innovations are happening, what's new, what's, kind of on point, that sort of thing.
So a question I would have about the communication back and forth. Sometimes the back of house, front of house thing comes up where, you like you say, and this has happened at the roastery here at Sunnergoss, where, we say, well, something is wrong with the coffee. And so we start asking questions about the batches and the roast, and did something happen? Was there a weird airflow issue? Because it's so available to us, that person is right there. And maybe something did go wrong because it keeps on tasting like that. So what is it? There just seems to be a ideal form of communication that could exist going both ways between roaster and barista. I wonder if you would maybe suggest what a good balance would be, where you taste a coffee as a barista and you think it tastes a little off, what is it that you think, as a roaster, what would you love to hear that a barista has already done? And then how would they best approach you and have a discussion about it?
So, I mean, our baristas are fantastic about this here at Gnosis. So, I mean, they'll work on dialing something in for quite a while before they'll come to pester me about it if something tastes off. And I think from both sides, so from the roaster side, I think we need to be respectful of the fact that the barista is the one in the thick of it day in and day out, and that they are dialing in and are doing that on the daily, whereas we maybe aren't dialing in on the daily for a particular coffee. And then on the barista side, there's, I think, a mutual respect in that they're not the roaster, and there may be things that they're unaware of on the roasting side. And so coming at it with that mutual respect and mutual understanding, I think, is the first way to kind of set it off right. And so assuming people are doing that and that they spend some time trying to dial it in. As a roaster, for me, the most helpful notes are not just it's off, but what they're actually tasting. So occasionally we'll be at a cupping table and I'll have to pressure people into giving me more information because they'll say, I don't like it. It's like, okay, well, realize that that's not in any way helpful. Other than I know that you're not going to probably ask this to be your personal coffee to take home this week. So tell me, what don't you like about it? Is the acidity too sharp? Is it sour? Is it lacking sweetness? Is the body too heavy, in your opinion? Is it too bitter? Like, kind of giving descriptors to what you're actually tasting. So, like, if a barista came and they said, okay, well, we've been pulling shots of this every way we can think, and it is got no acidity to it whatsoever. That's something I can very easily work with, because then I can check for that in terms of my roasting notes. I can go and I can maybe give some pointers as to how they might be able to get a little bit more acidity out of it so far as the brewing, just because of my background in brewing, as well. For me, that's something workable, whereas just coming and saying, like, it's off, is probably the less helpful thing. So I would say, like, coming in with that mutual respect, knowing that you're both working toward the same goal, and then communicating very specifically the things that you're tasting or not tasting, as the case may be.
Right. So you have a little empathy toward the other craft person that you're approaching, because as cool as your job is, and as expert as you are in it, someone else is going to make up another piece of that puzzle, and we don't all have the complete picture.
Right. A great example of this is, and this maybe is just funny, so I hope nobody takes offense to it, but when I was down in Brazil once, I was asking a farmer about a particular process and was seeing if they were interested in doing it. And apparently that farmer had decided that he was going to use the term barista as a pejorative, because they would have baristas come to the farm all the time to try and tell them how to do their farming practices differently.
Oh, no.
And he had been very annoyed by that, obviously, and probably for good reason. And so he was like, what are you, a barista? I was like, no, I used to be. At the end, 2 or 3 years later, he kind of came around on the idea, and it's something that we're doing now, which is some selective picking, which is a lot more expensive to do in Brazil. But it was just a really funny encounter. But I think that funny encounter is sometimes very true of how we all end up inadvertently treating each other in our industry.
Yeah, well, it's somewhat indicative of how we treat the coffee sometimes. Like, one size fits all. We don't approach it with the idea that it has its own personality or set of, idiosyncrasies. And I guess people are kind of like coffee in that way.
Yep.
So while we're learning about roasting, and, not all roasters are as accommodating, I would say. Like, a lot of baristas have approached the roaster maybe with the best of intention and attitude, and been blown off. And there is sort of like this mysterious part of roasting that people can get, high on their horse about, I guess. But so roasting can be because of that mystery, be really hyped. A lot of baristas will either want to become a manager, or they want to work in production to become a roaster. Or green buyer, whichever one. But I wonder what are some overhyped parts of the roasting profession that that those of us in retail are just all starry-eyed about, that maybe we shouldn't be.
So I will say this real quick to the part of the roasters not being forthcoming. A friend of mine who's a better roaster than I am has always liked to say that people are really closed off to sharing, and have been, I think, for a long time in our community in terms of roasting, because in some ways they're afraid to show people what they don't know, because roasting is something that we don't have as much scientific backing behind yet, so far as how the flavors are developed, or how a lot of these things work. And so I think that there's sometimes that the off-putting nature might just be a little bit of fear on the part of the person, or it could just be that they have a tude and they really need an attitude adjustment. Either way on that.
Maybe a little more airflow.
Yeah, just a touch. Just don't. Yeah, take it off aroma lock there. I think that a lot of people imagine roasting as this magical, artistic sort of thing, or at least that's how we've marketed it. Where you've got the person like sensually smelling the trier and making adjustments to the burner manually and all this sort of stuff. And that's not what the day-to-day of production feels like at all. By the time you've done your 6 Italian roasts in a row, and you've got 2 more to do before you can move on to the next production item, you don't feel like an artist. You feel like a production roaster, because that's what you are. There's a certain small segment of people in the industry that get the opportunity to design the profiles and tweak the profiles and be artistic with it. But for a lot of us, it's mostly just like putting your nose to the grindstone and cranking out batches. And it takes a very different sort of person to be able to do both of those tasks. The person who's the best production roaster may not be the best at profile design. They could be, but they may not be. And the person that's really great at profile design might be an absolutely awful production roaster, because they just get driven absolutely crazy by the monotony of it. And there is a sense of monotony to it, and a sense of solitude as well, because oftentimes you are alone by the roaster and production is either separated from you, or maybe you got headphones on. So there's a certain sense of solitude that comes with it as well, that some people work better with and some people don't. If you're being overly social, there's a chance you'll miss a turn down or miss a critical point at the roast and cause an issue. So, you can't be terribly social while you're roasting at the same time. So, I think production roasting is the reality for most people. And what we glamorize is that short bit of time in which someone's developing your profile and really feeling out a coffee in the roaster for the first time.
So the parts of the roasting process that we see are just a snapshot. It's similar to when I hire a barista, you talk to them about what the work actually is. We typically say it's 80% cleaning and stocking. And maybe there's that magic moment, like reaching out and giving a customer a cappuccino is the 10% of the time that you're doing that. You're not actually doing that all the time. And so there could be a lot of baristas that do want to become roasters that are that particular type of person, though.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think they have an advantage in the sense that they understand the brewing side to things. So there's some of that knowledge that is going to be maybe more transferable from that barista position. Yeah. My experience being a barista was a lot of bathroom cleaning, if I remember right.
Oh, yeah. Well, we serve a diuretic, so, that helps.
Yeah. It's
job security.
Sometimes it helps too much, I think.
So we kind of miss each other, production, front of house, baristas. And in moments like these, I feel like your book and your work and people that are listening today wanting to know more about the profession, and the future looks good for these folks, because I think there's this idea that we want to learn more about the other and the craft of the other. To this point in our industry, I think a lot of what we've created is partially based on understanding and a lot based on misunderstanding. I mean, from a roaster's perspective, do you see anything in cafes that you can pinpoint? You're like, that is being done in the cafe because of a misunderstanding of roasting?
I guess one of the things that I think that there's a misunderstanding on, maybe isn't so much from the roasting side, but there's communicating the reality of the farming side, which is people are always, especially people that tend to brew coffee, are searching for these coffees that are just magical all the time. And the reality is that, the farmers' lives are changed when people are able to buy that 83 point coffee at a much higher price and kind of push and sell that to people that want just a really nice, mild, super drinkable coffee, than they are the 10 bags of crazy, amazing micro lot that we in the coffee industry tend to get the most excited about. Buying 100 bags at a higher price versus buying 10 bags at a higher price, one does a lot bigger difference for the farmer. So I think that there's this obsession with amazing stellar coffees on the retail side. And I have that same excitement as a roaster, but I think it needs to be tempered with the understanding of the reality that, we're trying to help not only present amazing, crazy good specialty coffees, but specialty coffees are coffees that score 80 points and higher. And that we're trying to provide really good, decent specialty coffee to people who are looking for something a little bit more accessible. And that our ability to use and sell those coffees is actually going to potentially make a larger change for the farmer in a positive way.
Is that compromising quality in your mind at all?
I don't think so, because, most of the world is still drinking sub 80 point coffee. And a lot of the people that are generally out there in the world, and a lot of the larger customer base of specialty coffee, is people that are interested in drinking, 82 to 84 point coffee. And they want something that's smooth and sweet and balanced and clean. And they don't necessarily need the crazy acidity, and they don't need all these other things. And I think we've got a real opportunity to present side by side crazy great high-end specialty coffee with really approachable specialty coffee that resonates with a larger audience, and kind of use that to help the farmers that we're buying the crazy good stuff from to have an even better livelihood, because we're buying the quote unquote lower score coffee at a better price point.
A lot of our excitement of coffee comes from the sensory experience.
For sure.
And so much of what I hear you saying has to do with the experience of knowing the background, the science, the story, what's actually going to produce a sustainable, livelihood and future for coffee. Is that a good way, as we learn about that, to get excited about 83 point coffee?
Yeah, I think for sure. And part of that too comes from, for anybody who's listening to this, if they have the opportunity to travel and to meet with farmers in producing areas, it's not something where you really walk away from it and say, yeah, we shouldn't be paying them more money. I don't know of anybody that goes to Origin and thinks that kind of walking away. There's, more often than not, it's, hey, how can we help them have a more sustainable way of life in terms of what we're paying them? Not because they're doing anything wrong, but because we need to find a way to bring their coffee to market and give them more money so that they can have a better way of life, because currently most of the pricing structure for coffee is unsustainable. And so, while it's really cool that we're paying a high price for a small bag quantity, if we can find ways to get our market segment in our area buying a better quality coffee than they're used to, but it's a more approachable 83, 84 point coffee that we can then buy from the farmer at a price that meets their needs and gives them a profit margin to make them comfortable and have a better life. I think that that's part of what we should be excited about too, because ultimately what we have to do from all ends, whether it's the baristas, the roasters, etc., is we have to educate the customers to be willing to pay more money for coffee in order to make that happen. And as a roaster, I'm definitely fine with talking about the coffees I'm super excited about. Like, oh, we got this honey geisha in, or we've got this amazing Kenya, or we've got this, Brazil selective pick that's just absolutely fantastic. Like, that's all fun and well and good. But we also have to remember that by talking up the coffees that are going to be more approachable and by selling more of those coffees as well, we're also making a difference. And I've had friends that farm coffee now for, I think, over 9 years. And that friendship has changed my perspective to not just be one of like, yes, intense quality only, but intense quality when it's available, yes, for sure. But finding a way to be sustainable with the people that I care about and work with on a year-to-year basis in terms of the farming, and finding ways and finding inroads and finding customers that maybe for most specialty coffee don't seem like the most exciting customers, but they are exciting because they're helping us change lives other places. So that's probably long-winded and
no, it's
whatever.
great.
That's how I feel about it.
Well, it fits right along with a few episodes that we've been talking with folks like Hannah Neuschwander talking about World Coffee Research, talking with Kelly from the podcast Coffea, telling a story of Brazilian coffee farmers and farm life, etc. Just the barista side of things, the retail side of things can tend to be pretty isolated, and I suppose we all can be, but by reaching out to your roaster, who has a direct line to the importer, more so than the barista does, and learning more about origin and the types of flavors you can get out of those coffees just by, modulating, shall we say, the flavor of coffee, we can get really excited about things. And it sounds like we have a lot of homework to do. So I wonder, how can we stay in touch with you, what you're doing, where you're speaking, and where can we get your book?
For a lot of that, you can go to my website, which is just host.coffee. And I try and post a lot there, although I'm not nearly as good at updating as I should be. My Instagram and my Twitter are both at robhoos, ROBHOOS. I don't really friend people on Facebook unless I know them, so that's probably not the best place to reach me, because that's mostly pictures of my kids,
right,
family. So, but those are some great ways to kind of meet up with me and see what I'm doing. And I mean, the thing that I love about our industry is that there's no end to the learning. I've been roasting coffee since, I think, 2009. I'd have to look at my resume to see what it actually is. But I'm still learning about roasting every day. I've been in the coffee industry for over 12 years, and I'm still learning about brewing and coffee origins and cultivars and all of this stuff that is just absolutely fantastic and wonderful. And so the thing that I think encourages me the most is that there's no end to learning here. Like, we're just constantly learning and evolving, and it's fantastic.
Sweet. Thank you so much, Rob. That was really inspirational. It was really informative. I think it just helped us learn a lot too. So thanks for joining us today on the show, and I hope you have a restful December and January.
I appreciate that. Thank you. And thank you for having me. It's been wonderful for me to be on here and get to talk to an old friend too.
Well, I am thankful that we got the opportunity to talk to Rob. And my thanks again to Rob for coming on the show and sharing with us his experiences as a roaster, a little bit about his book and what was behind that book and what are his goals. And then the science of roasting. I feel like I learned a lot, and it makes me want to learn more. Kind of dive into some of those books that he was talking about. That we'll have links to those books in the show notes as well. His included, of course. And honestly, you should really buy his book because it's only 64 pages, I believe. Not a very long book at all. And to be completely honest, I feel like a lot of us are drawn to the idea of learning about the farm, and that's great, and we should. But how many of us are actually drawn to learning more about the roasting process in the same way? In some ways, it might be just more mysterious to us, or just like Rob found, there's not a lot of information out there. And that's one of the goals of his book, is to take a approach to roasting that breaks down the universal elements of roasting and how they apply to flavor and what you can do to affect flavor. Some of the things that I found really helpful was the discussion about water quality and how when you're tasting a coffee that you feel is under roasted, and I hear that a lot, and I've said that a lot, that it might not be in fact under roasted according to what the roaster actually experienced in the extraction of that coffee. Rob was talking about how every time they send their coffee, before they did this, thinking about water, they would send their coffee to a competition and they say it was pretty roasty. But in fact, for them, in their water minerality, it wasn't roasty at all. And so that's a factor that's super important, as well as looking at all of the other elements like the ratio of brewing, the grind particle size distribution, all of that. It's also interconnected that it does necessarily give us pause as baristas. Pause before we make an assumption about what's happening in the roasting process. So first of all, we don't really read a ton about roasting as baristas. And second of all, we might be brewing the coffee in a way that it was never meant to be brewed, or at least in a way that it wasn't tailored to be brewed. So with that in mind, we're given some guidelines that we can follow to make sure that we are doing our part as baristas and coffee service professionals to explore all the possibilities of what could be happening to that coffee, and then bring specific information back to the roaster in a spirit of mutual respect. Certainly, I have, and many of us have, brought some grand sweeping assumption to a roaster and in effect told them how to do their job without actually knowing how to do their job at all. And I don't think that we would appreciate it if a roaster came up and tried to tell us how to extract an espresso, well, unless that roaster was really great at extracting espresso. We do need to focus in on our niche, on our particular place in the cafe, in the roastery, and then have this mutual respect and this good conversation. And when we do have that conversation, we have to bring some specific information. You could bring something very general to a roaster, but if the goal is to really find out what happened to the coffee, then good specific information about, with flavor descriptors, is it acidic, is it undersweet, is it bitter, is it astringent? Those are helpful things. And Rob was saying sometimes somebody will say, well, I just don't like it. And that's just not helpful. We ended off talking about the farm. We ended talking about the idea that the promotion of these like 82, 84 point coffees can really help the farmer. And with Rob's work helping roasters really get the most out of every coffee, I have a feeling the more those principles are applied and the more just we learn scientifically, as is Rob's goal, as with his work with Morten Munchau with the University of Copenhagen and his book, we want the scientific process to really take root in the roasting world. And the more we learn about how to really get the most out of these coffees, the more well-received these 82, 84 point coffees are going to be. And it's all a learning process. And that is where I just really resonate with what Rob is talking about. Is the industry is just a never-ending learning process. So today was a learning process for a lot of us here. I am in that group of people that learned something about roasting coffee, and I'm excited to see what happens in the future with Rob's work. And if you want to reach out to Rob, you can do so by visiting his website. You can go to hoos.coffee, and that's spelled HOOS.coffee. And there you're going to find his book, his blog, just information about his consulting. And you can also find him on Instagram and Twitter. It's just Rob, R-O-B, Hoos, H-O-O-S, Rob Hoos on Instagram and Twitter. And it would really be cool to go out and see him speak. We're going to have some links in the show notes so that you can see some of his presentations. And go out there and buy that book, Modulating the Flavor Profile of Coffee, One Roaster's Manifesto. And I think you're really going to be glad that you did. Now, if you want to learn more about Keys to the Shop, you can go to keystotheshop.com. And we have the show notes there. We also have all of our past episodes. And speaking of show notes, if you go right now to the website, you will have an opportunity to fill in a form with just your email address. And what that does is it signs you up for a weekly delivery of the show notes to your inbox. And the show notes are basically the highlights from each episode, key takeaways, if you will. And also, on occasion, we'll include more links to helpful resources beyond what is also mentioned in the episode, which is also included in the show notes. So real convenient, doesn't take much time. Just fill in your email address and that will be sent to you on a weekly basis. And of course, the goal of this show has always been to help the coffee community grow and thrive and learn and explore different aspects of the retail coffee world and how we can become better service professionals. And this year has been just fantastic. There's been so many topics covered, so many great guests, and I can't wait to see what 2018 holds. And I hope you all have an amazing week and continue to have an awesome holiday season wherever you are in that process. And as always, it is such an honor that you would spend time and listen to this show. I hope to make it continually better for you and more valuable. And I truly do hope that this episode has given you keys to the shop.